Welcome to the Niche Enrollment Insights podcast. In this podcast, our goal is to focus less on the promise of best practices. Instead, look for the processes and questions that spark internal reflection and lead to novel solutions tailored to your institution. I'm Will Patch, Senior Enrollment Insights Leader for Higher Ed at Niche, and my guest today is Angela Brown. It's it is our fourth quarterly look back at what are some of the enrollment and marketing insights that we've learned about and want to talk about more. So we're looking at the fourth quarter of 2023, and we'll take a look. How are you doing, Angela?
I am well. I can't complain. We're recording in January of 2024, post holiday, at a time when lots of people are dealing with various illnesses. So I'm
Yep.
pretty happy not to be in that boat. We made it through some travel and family time,
Mhm.
mostly healthy. So,
Good.
feeling pretty excited and optimistic for a new year.
Yep.
New Year's are always fun.
Yep. Have a good break and a good New Year's.
I did. I did. How about you? How was yours?
It went way too fast. My
Yeah.
parents flew back up from Florida, and we got to hang out with them and spend a lot of time with the kids since they're out of school and they're still out of school. So
Oh,
it's
wow,
yeah,
still?
yeah. They don't go back till the ninth around here. So
Really?
yeah,
Oh my goodness. Bless your heart. Well, good luck
yep.
with that.
It, there's the one big change I'm really excited about is that we're in a brand new studio space. It's a virtual
We
studio still.
are. Yes, this is
Yep.
exciting. It's one giant experiment, but we're pretty
Yeah.
pumped about it.
So there'll be some video components people can watch later and things like that. But
Mhm.
very exciting. Well, Angela, let's jump in. I know we've got a lot. We'll try and keep things tight and go from there. What are some of the things you learned about this fourth quarter that you're excited about?
So as I was saying before we started recording, this was really hard. It's we typically do these kind of right up against the end of a quarter, and so between the break and the new year, I had to kind of shake out some cobwebs and remember some of the things that I read
Mhm.
in Q4. But everything that I am going to talk about today is very marketing focused, so I'll add that disclaimer for
Mhm.
everyone. Not so much enrollment, but as we often say, the two are very connected. So the first piece is these are all blog posts, so we'll share them in the show notes. But the first piece that I'm going to talk about is from one of my favorite humans, Julie Falstick from Stony Creek Strategy. She has an outstanding newsletter that I highly recommend subscribing to if you're in the independent school leadership space. I mean, she covers marketing, she covers headship, fundraising, board relations, all of the things. So really, really great follow. But I'm a particular fan of her musings on all things Marcom. And so the title of this article, in and of itself, makes it worth reading. It's Admissions Marcom Development, Three-Legged Stool or Triangle of Sadness. And I mean, if that's not a hook, I don't know what is. So big
I
shout
love
out to
that.
Julie for the headline writing skills there. But this was a follow up piece that she did to a previous article, I think from might have been earlier in 2023, maybe 2022, about the marketing communications function in independent schools. And that was a piece, we'll link to that one as well, because it's definitely worth a read if you haven't seen it. But it resonated with a lot of people, including me, since that's the role that I had before I joined Niche. And it starts by talking about some common issues, burnout, mixed messages about the importance of the role. Some people think it's very important. Some people um, inadvertently send signals that it might not be. And of course, we have the tale, the old tale of people who consume communications and think that that makes them experts in the field. And so all of that's tough. One of the things that she's been hearing a lot from folks just in her work, both at Stony Creek and also with her newsletter, is that people working in these roles are really looking for connection. They want their voices to be heard. This is still The Markham function in independent schools has been around for a while now, and there still isn't necessarily a central community for people who are working in those roles. And so I think that desire for community is something that's really kind of something that she's hearing loud and clear. I know I've definitely heard it myself. And so the article digs into what an ideal Marcom function should look like. And I'm going to quote Julie here because this is a really great quote. She said, "We believe the ideal in 2023 when this was written, but I think this is true in 2024 as well, is to have a communications office run by a communications professional with a clear job description."
Mhm.
But notice it's not the laundry list of hopes and dreams that we typically see in job
Yeah.
descriptions, but a
Plus other
clearly
duties as
defined description.
assigned and
Other duties as assigned. I still see references in job descriptions to platforms that no longer exist, which says a lot about
Mhm.
who's probably writing these descriptions, who manages a discrete budget and reports to the head of school, which is something that I agree with wholeheartedly across the board. But she does point out the fact that that's not necessarily possible at every institution from, budgetary concerns, culture. There are a lot of factors that can play into that format not necessarily working. And
Mm.
so she shares some very concrete ways that admissions development and communications professionals that their roles can be defined in ways that are intentionally complementary, because ideally that's how it should be. But there's so much good stuff in the article. I couldn't, I won't cover all of it here, but it was something that I really it was like I felt it, when I was
Mhm.
reading it. I was doing a lot of head nodding, and it brought back a lot of memories. It definitely connects with things that I continue to hear from people who are working in these roles. And so ideally, I think that the three-legged stool is aspirational. Sometimes it can feel like a triangle of sadness. I hope you're not in one of those institutions where that's the way that it works. But I'm a big believer in, if you don't have an advancement model, so to speak, where admissions, Marcom, and development all sort of feed up into the same leadership structure, those three offices really should work together. And I think admissions and development really are the two that probably have the greatest opportunities to connect a bit more intentionally.
Mhm. It's really more of a relationship life cycle at that point.
Yes.
A
Yes,
and
absolutely.
is that a model you've seen some places where they all are brought together as one customer experience? They probably wouldn't say customer, but one student, parent, community experience life cycle department?
No. So
That
so
would be incredibly
typically
complicated, but
it would, and it's such an interesting point that you make though, because I think the advancement model structurally is fairly common, where you have those three offices feeding up to, an assistant head of school who might oversee advancement or something under that. They're all under the same umbrella. But where I think the big opportunity is for them to work together in more of that life cycle family experience structure. I think
Mhm,
that's the piece that's actually missing, where, they all report to the same person, but I don't think that schools have mastered the art of making sure that that flywheel is being fed. And so the communications person can end up being a bridge between those two offices, but
mhm,
there isn't necessarily constant communication in that sort of cyclical way, where admissions is making sure that there's a handoff that's happening with fundraising that feels very organic and
mhm.
very natural. Typically there's a handoff from admission to everyone.
Yeah.
And, like you
Admissions
take,
has
it's like,
I mean,
okay.
same thing in higher ed. Admissions has to be
Yeah.
the hub of the wheel, that
Yeah.
everything flows through and around, and yet all these people out on the tire don't always talk to each other, but admissions has
Exactly.
to be that go-between.
Yep. Yep. And I think there's also something to be said too about making sure that there's continuity of experience between different
Mhm,
types of families, because the families, this is another one of those things that happens all the time. The families that have the greatest capacity to give get the most
Mhm.
attention. They tend to get the most information. They get the most opportunities.
Yep.
And there's got to be a better way to do that too.
Yeah, that is. I mean, you hear the phrase "the squeaky wheel gets the grease," right?
Yep.
It's maybe a better one in this case would be the nicest wheel gets the road. I don't. Maybe that's not why it's not a saying, but the the tire with the most tread on it is the one that gets the most love. Um,
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
not necessarily the one that needs the attention who gets the most attention.
I think that's true. And, I, not to belabor points from our parent survey, but I do think to go back to the idea that your current parents play such a critically important role in also fueling fueling your
Yeah.
enrollment flywheel, right? And so a current parent, regardless of their giving capacity, has the same ability to encourage or discourage other people in the community from considering your institution. Right. And so that's something that's really important as well. It's not just the families that have the highest giving capacity who have the ability to go out into the market and talk about the experience that they're having at your institution.
Mhm.
And so there is some degree of equity in treatment that has to be in place. But if those three departments are not talking to each other and they're not constantly working together to manage those experiences, that's where I think things can get really messy. But that also tends to be the way that it works.
Mhm. Yeah. There was thinking about this life cycle management really. There's a committee I was on probably 7 years ago now. Yeah, that's probably right. 7 or 8 even. That we were tasked with kind of reimagining a university structure. And so we're looking at, okay, what are the different functions? Do we need, what layers of management do we really need versus what's always there? And so we're looking at similar institutions and similar styles of companies even outside, and really came up with a model that I was really championing, and it was too wild to actually get used. I doubt anyone would ever use it, but there were essentially 3 VPs, so you had everything filtering down to 3 buckets. There were the external relations, there was internal relations, and there was operations.
Mm,
And so you have this very easy flow. Anything that deals with those outside the university all goes through one communication structure, one management structure. Anything internally, and that is recruitment, that is current students, that is alumni, all report through one VP. So you have one communication all the way through. Handoffs are all managed within one structure. So you didn't have to worry about that. Well, okay, are we talking to this group or they talk to that one because they all live together?
mhm, mhm.
And sounds similar to what we were just talking about.
Hopes and dreams, Will.
Yep.
Hopes and dreams.
Yep. What else was on your big Q4?
So this is the last two are very, very closely related. The
Mhm.
first is about taking a buyer-centric approach to competitive positioning, and this one's from April Dunford, which if folks are not familiar with her, she wrote a book called Obviously Awesome that I read last year. That's a
Well,
fabulous
that's a
book
very
on
fitting book for you. Obviously
it.
awesome.
Well, oh, that's very kind. Very kind. The book is actually about positioning, and it's a great primer on that topic. She also wrote a book called Sales Pitch: How to Craft a Story and Stand Out and Win, and that is something that's on my Amazon wish list currently as I dig through all of the books that I am hoping to read this year. But this article is from her newsletter. I think it was in November, December, and it talks about the importance of understanding your competitive landscape and what you're positioning against when you're creating your messaging. And this is written from a business perspective, but as if people have been following me for a while, you know that one of my favorite things to do is to find things that are happening in the business world and look for ways to connect them to what's happening in the school world. And
Mhm.
so there are a lot of parallels here for schools. One of the points that she makes is that a lot of businesses get this competitive positioning wrong because they get caught up in their own definition of what competition means. And so they're focused on specific businesses and brands that they believe to be their peers. And I think schools, to the extent that they're actually following their competitors, some do a better job of doing this than others. That tends to be the focus, is what is the school down the street doing? But if you look at things from a buyer's perspective, just like people do with B2B services, which is the world that we live in now, it's not just about the other educational environments that parents are looking at, but it's also the other options that they have. So the way that she breaks this down is that you can stay where you are. So in this case, a parent can decide to keep their children at the school that they currently attend. They can choose a new solution, which ideally is what you're hoping for. You want them to choose you, or they can do nothing. And what's tricky here is that the third option sounds a lot like the first one, but in April's world, doing nothing actually means going through the process of evaluating new solutions, in this case, other schools, only to decide to abandon the process altogether because you don't find what you're looking for. You don't see enough differentiation. And
Mhm.
so, to earn a new family's enrollment, you have to position yourselves not just against other schools, but against those three options. And she does a really good job of taking a deep dive into what that looks like for each of the different options, which is really powerful. But I think it's a different way to think about competition where it's not just other institutions, but it's the actual options that families have. And so you want to make sure that they choose a new solution and that no solution is yours.
Mhm. Yeah. That's something that's been talked about in higher ed for a while, in the sense that students have a lot of options. They can go into the workforce. They can go into the military. They can start a community college. They can go to a 4-year. There's a lot. They can sit on mom and dad's couch. There's a lot of options. You don't going into it with the assumption of, well, they're going to pick someone, so they should pick us.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
necessarily the case. And do you want to
They
keep
may pick
chasing
no
your
one.
exactly. And your
Yeah.
peers, are your peers the schools like you, or are your peers the schools that the students who are enrolling at you are also considering? And I feel
Right.
like we've talked about this before, where I've had colleges argue with me and say, no, those aren't our peer institutions. But when a student is saying, I'm considering these two colleges, even if they're nothing alike, that is your peer institution. That is your competitor. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what the numbers say. If I'm considering, you know, if I'm considering Stanford and Purdue, or Stanford and Ball State, or, y- I mean, while on paper, there's not a lot of similarities there. It doesn't matter. It matters what the students are saying, what the students are considering.
I think that's such a great point because when I hear questions from schools, and this tends to happen more in the independent and private school
Hmm.
space than with districts, although I would say this is something that everyone should be thinking about. When they're thinking about doing competitive analysis, you don't want to make any assumptions about who your peer schools are. I think
Hmm.
everybody in a school leadership position has their own thoughts about who they compete with. Sometimes those thoughts are aspirational, right? And
Yep.
so it's really important to make sure that you're getting feedback from the market, looking at the other schools that your prospective and new families considered when they were going through the
Hmm.
process. You can get that information through surveys. For families that didn't choose you, finding out where they did decide to go. And typically, when you're going through a branding exercise, you'll get feedback from the broader marketplace, other institutional leaders, other folks in your community who can give you a sense of how other people perceive you. And that's a really important exercise to go through when you're thinking about your competition.
Hmm. Tell me, I'm thinking out loud here, so tell me if this makes sense.
Mhm.
If we relate this then to branding and positioning, It does it make sense to think of it in terms of, do you want to be the hunter gatherers who are chasing the herds, chasing the weather, or are you going to be farmers setting up shop in one place saying, here's who we are, here's what we do? What is that making
Say
sense in those
more.
terms?
Say
Yeah.
more.
So So when we think of always chasing our competitors, you're going to be
Hmm.
always trying to, okay, well, they're saying this or they're doing this type of event. We should do that too. They add
Yeah.
this program. We should add that too. They
Yeah.
upgraded this facility. We should do that too. Or do you say, here's our community. Here's who we serve. Here's what they need. We're going to focus on these things. We're not going to chase the shiny new object. We're not going to chase the new program. We're not going to invest in this thing because all the schools around us are. We're going to invest in this thing that our community says they need. It, that
It
I'm
does
thinking out
make
loud here,
sense.
but
No, and I now I'm tracking, and I will say it's
yeah.
absolutely the latter.
Mm,
And when you look at the way that April breaks things down in terms of how you can position yourself against one of these different one of these other categories, right?
mhm,
There's a lot about you being true to who you are, right? And so it's not because a lot of the time, indecision, the thing that causes the do nothing, it's
mhm.
because they are afraid of making a bad decision. And there's
Yep.
not enough differentiation between their options for them to have a clear winner. So if all you're doing is chasing other institutions and trying to look like other institutions, that actually makes the problem worse. It makes it
Yeah.
more difficult for the person in the buying position to make a choice because you're getting analysis paralysis. And it's actually the next article that that I will reference for Q4 is about singularity in brand position and brand positioning and how important it is to choose the thing that
Mhm.
you truly own. So don't make it up. It can't, it shouldn't be aspirational. It should be something that is truly uniquely yours and continuing to communicate that and really drawing that line in the sand because if you're just in the game of chasing your competitors and consistently iterating based on what someone else is doing, that other institution is not you.
Mhm.
They might be making those choices and adding those offerings and making these structural changes because of the work that they have done to make those decisions because those decisions make sense for those institutions. What makes sense for someone else doesn't necessarily make sense for you.
Mhm.
And so it's really important to just choose that area of focus and stick with it because if you don't, you're going to end up just making it harder for people to make a choice.
Yeah. Yep. And we've got a nice segue there into your next one, you say,
Perfect.
right?
And to my last one, actually, I tried to be faster with these this time because sometimes I do too many. So this one is from Lindsay Peterson, who is another great follow. She is an expert on brand strategy and someone that I think I've referenced her before. I discovered her through a LinkedIn course and started following her newsletter. And this is, as I mentioned, about singularity and brand positioning. And so this article talks about the importance of having focus in positioning your brand because when you add too many promises, you're diluting your message, you're diluting your visibility and making it harder for you to be distinguished from other institutions or entities, right? And
Mhm.
so one of the things that, I've heard this narrative a lot with private and independent schools. I'm sure you've probably heard it with higher ed institutions as well, but the notion of trying to be all things to all people,
Yeah.
right? And that comes from one, I think there's still a long way to go for a lot of institutions to really nail what their brands are. A lot of people haven't figured that out.
Mhm.
So that's part of it. And in the absence of having a strong brand, they try to do everything, which is not great. And that's why we
Mhm.
get the same, 15 phrases on every website, right?
Yep.
Um, and that's what this is really trying to get to. So Lindsay talks about the importance of picking a lane and focusing on the one thing that you do that bridges the gap between what's actually compelling to prospective families, but again, something that your institution can truly own. And I think that piece deserves a lot of emphasis because when I look at things like taglines and mottos, sayings, all of the things, right?
Mhm.
There's such a lack of differentiation and they don't really tell you anything. And so it's really important to have a brand promise or positioning statement that is uniquely yours. And that requires work. That's not, I mean,
Mm.
that's I think that's a big part of it in the K-12 space, is that going through that work requires a lot of effort and financial resources that not everyone has, but it's really important work to do because it informs so many other things, not just in the marketing communications office or in the admissions office or, the people who deal with words, but also the
Yeah.
people who are delivering the experience, right? So that there's a trickle down effect to how your faculty engage with families, how your brand is represented on your grounds and your enrollment events and your curriculum. There's this sort of butterfly effect with branding and positioning work. Ideally, that should happen when it's done well, and it's really hard to do that effectively if you don't do the work on the front end.
Yeah. It's that you see the words academic excellence everywhere. Well, that's an expectation. That's not brand.
Everywhere,
Yeah.
right, right.
I mean, if you just said mediocre academics, I mean, in some cases that might be honest, but that's also not a brand either.
I see a lot of phrases on websites that are table stakes, right?
Yes.
Like it's really
I was trying to
interesting,
think of that phrase you've used before. I like
Yeah,
that.
it's
Yep.
I mean it's of course you have academic
Hmm.
excellence for 40 or $50,000 a year, right?
Yeah.
I would hope so.
Caring
Is
teachers.
it's right, right.
Yeah.
A love of learning, all of the,
Yep.
it's all of the things. And I just went through a process where once again I was judging website homepages for the Inspired School Marketers Brilliance Awards, which I love
Hmm.
doing every year. But it's still happening. It's still happening and still seeing some of the same things. And I always give better scores to the homepages that have really strong copy that differentiates the institution beyond great design. Design is wonderful, but I still need you to tell me something about the institution that's going to make me want to click on the other parts of your website, right?
Hmm.
And I'm not going to do that if you're saying the same thing as everyone else, even if the website looks beautiful.
Yeah. It has to be something that is compelling and informative. If it's
Yes.
just informative and there's nothing interesting about it, okay, who cares? If it's just
Right.
really engaging and cool, but there's no meat to it, I mean, there has to be that blend.
Yeah,
Yep.
for sure.
Yep. Well, like you, I started out with a long list of things, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's gonna be too much." So I decided instead to focus in on one thing that
Yes.
filled up, because we have video, I can show this now, a lot
Yeah,
of
I
pages
know.
of my notebook. Uh, uh, I went to AMA Higher Ed in Chicago. A nice short drive for me for a change. Conferences, I usually have to hop on a flight and get a ride to the hotel from the airport and all that. But this is nice. It's just a 3 hour drive to downtown Chicago, and so I just it was a great experience. Very energetic conference. Uh, I would say it was one of the strongest conferences I've been to in a while, just
That's
because
awesome.
of the amount of content that I was jotting down ideas, notes, thought starters. So I wanted to touch on some of them. Um, the first one, that not a lot that I want to say beyond this, because I think everyone will get immediately. Just this need for higher ed, and I would say K-12 can get in on this too. This need to be on the offensive about defending the value of education, rather than
Yes.
sitting back and either ignoring the hits or just responding to things as they come. Instead, being more proactive in the messaging and really
Yeah.
going out and talking about, this is why higher education matters. Here are the outcomes. Here are the things that it does for society. Uh, Rather than saying back, I mean, you're seeing angry mobs taking out college presidents now, essentially,
It's crazy.
and
Crazy.
boards being replaced and completely
Yeah.
changing the school. I mean, can't just sit back and let that happen, or the value of higher ed will actually be degraded.
Yeah.
Um, so just
Yeah.
going forward, talking more about that value. Uh, one of there were a few themes that came up across sessions, and um, there were really three themes, and then one speaker I want to dive into because he was incredible. That was the nice thing. All the keynotes, there were multiple keynotes, and all of them you just leave saying that was incredible.
I
Uh,
love that.
yeah, the first big theme here, talking about brand's future. What's the
Mhm.
future of branding? Really being core in relationships rather than identities. Um, the big thing there, talking about communication, marketing communications, um, really using social media to support and solve problems rather than constantly being the megaphone saying, "We're great, we did this, here's a press release." Really seeking out, using social listening to say, "Here are the key problems people are facing. Let's solve them. Let's address them." That it's that two-way. It's that being a person rather
Yeah.
than a nameplate blasting out information. Uh, Focusing also as a brand, removing friction and focusing on customer experience, student experience, parent experience. Uh, that's a major one. How can we find these friction points, these pain points, and solve them for people as a brand?
Mhm.
Uh, we'll be much better at building those relationships rather than just saying we are this institution. You should love us because of that. If
Right.
you're if you're removing barriers, if you're being supportive, if you're providing a great consistent experience, and that experience needs to be consistent from recruitment through graduation and beyond, rather than making promises and being really one-on-one in recruitment and then not being like that at all while they're a
What?
student. I know, it's unheard of.
That
And
doesn't
then as soon as they're alumni, all of a sudden it's, "Hey, buddy, how you doing again?" That's
Uh-huh.
not consistent.
No.
Um, and I know that doesn't happen anywhere now, but
No.
uh, uh, letting students, your audience, parents, whomever, determine what's broken and how to prioritize it. That was a really
Mm.
interesting one that came up in a couple different sessions. One focused on doing what they call it, is uh, DIY user research, I think it was. Uh, and rather than saying, we as people who see this and work in it every day, this process, this part of the website, this app, whatever is broken, we should really focus our resources there. It doesn't matter what we think because we're
Mhm.
working it every day. We have different needs.
Yeah.
Letting the students, letting the parents say, here's the things that are pain points for us. And there may be real mismatches there, because the things that you think, oh, yeah, this works great, they instead might say, no, 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 this is a huge pain. Or this thing is really broken. They say, no, I've never thought of that before. That's not a problem at all. Um,
I really love that because I one of the things I talk about all the time, especially as it relates to students in K-12, is that everyone making decisions, it's all a bunch of adults,
yep.
middle-aged people sitting in a conference room deciding what the students want and what the students need.
Yep.
And that is a really big missed opportunity. You should not only gather feedback from parents, for one, and you shouldn't only gather feedback once a year. Like everybody does, well, not everybody, but
Some
a
people.
good percentage of people do an annual parent survey, but
Mhm.
it's also important to gather feedback from newly enrolled families. It's important to get feedback from your students, and not just about what's happening in the classroom, but the tools that you're using and the spaces. So many of these decisions are made about like, oh, we're going to get a new SIS system, or, we're going to add this new course. And it's based on nothing other than conversations that have happened by a bunch of people who are not being directly impacted by
Mhm.
those choices. So it's critical to make the time to gather that feedback and not just make all of those decisions in a vacuum.
Yeah. And I loved the example that they gave of, you can basically just set up a table in the cafeteria with some cookies and have them test a web page, a process. I would even
Yeah.
carry it over to, hey, we've got, here's two postcards, here's two photos, here's um two bulleted lists of content we want to put out there. Which one catches your eye? Which one is
Mhm.
someone who lives this every day fits us better? It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a huge thing. Like, get 1 or 2 minute feedback from students as they walk by. Hand them a cookie. They're happy.
There's so much power in giving students food.
Yes.
Seriously. I
Oh, yeah.
it
Yep.
is really if you give them a snack or you wanna do a focus group and bring
Mhm.
in some tacos, there's a lot of power in that. A
Yep.
lot of power in that.
We would always say students will do anything for a free T-shirt, but you can get cookies even cheaper.
Oh, yeah. You can bake them.
You probably could. Yep. Uh, uh, so that I mean, having that consistency. Um,
Mhm.
the other one that I'll tease for an upcoming webinar uh,
Ooh.
that came up actually in 2 different sessions, really leaning into athletics branding, but not leaning on athletics branding for recruitment. Saying, here's the things that are working with athletics, here's what we're recognized for already. Because even at small colleges that don't have the big D1, they're not being shown on ESPN or anything like that. There is a athletics identity.
Mhm,
Now,
mhm.
some colleges really lean into that and across the board say we are this, we are Spartans, we are Crimson, whatever. But
Yeah.
instead saying, um, here's the things we're known for. How do we weave that into and take these people who are committed to athletics and take these things that they know already, convert them over to our overall branding? And so there's a fine line there. Um, Boise State is doing a tremendous job, so they'll be joining us for that webinar. But
That's
um,
great.
yeah, just a really interesting idea uh, of merging social listening with athletic identity. How do we make that all work for recruitment, for awareness outside of just you have a good basketball team, you have a good football team, things like that.
Right, right.
Yep. And it doesn't just have to be about athletics, but or recruitment even. I mean, alumni will have some stories there, but also how do we engage the community? How do we get community interest, engagement, investment in us
Mhm.
as an institution by tying it to something that they might already partake in?
That's great.
Uh, the speaker I wanted to talk about is really tied into that. Marcus Collins. He's got a great book out whose name I can't find off the top of my head here, but we'll include it. Uh, just really engaging, really interesting, really talking about um, branding and community and engagement. Uh, One of the things he said that I really like: brands don't stand for something; they stand in for something.
Hmm.
A brand doesn't say, you know, I like this product, so that's who I am. It's standing in for your value.
Mhm,
It's saying,
mhm.
I mean, we see this all the time, right? The
Yeah.
people who, well, I drive a Tesla because I drive a Subaru because I drive a
Mhm.
Ford F-150 because
Yeah.
there's it's standing in for a value, a belief, something about you. Um, it's a different concept. It's subtle, but
Yeah.
it's different there. Um, he talked about the life cycle of what a brand was, where a brand mark started as a legal mark, so that people could say, "Oh, this is a product made
Mhm.
by this artisan." Moving all the way now, it's identity. He said tribe. I prefer sort of community, but
Yeah.
it's really morphed so that you
Yeah.
say, I mean, and you see this online all the time on Reddit and elsewhere where you have entire communities. Like, I use RecTech smokers. There's a community around RecTech. There's a Traeger community. There's a Gorilla community. I mean, within that microcosm of the world, people are really, really loyal to something. You see that with Apple all the time, right?
Mhm.
There are
Yep.
Apple people where they think is the greatest product ever made, and if you're like me and you use Android, they don't like you in their chats and things like that. There's a reason Apple does that little mark in the chats and makes it
Oh,
harder for people.
yeah.
It
Yes.
is all about that community. Um, Something I think really ties into they talked about here what we think of in recruitment and advancement and anything else. Just because you have a lot of information about someone, that doesn't mean that there is a sense of intimacy. Just because you know them doesn't mean that you have a relationship. You still have to
That's
make that effort.
big.
Yeah,
Yeah.
still have to make the effort,
Yeah.
build the community, build the relationship. you can't just sidle up next to them and start talking about all the things they know just because you have
Mhm.
this information, you have these data points. Information is not intimacy. It's really interesting, I think, in a lot of ways. Are you familiar with parasocial relationships? Or
No.
yeah, it's a so, and this is me highly summarizing, but it's a this idea that, well, I know a lot about this person, so I feel like we're close. It happens with
Ah,
podcasts a lot, where I listen
yeah.
to these podcasts, and there was a great episode several years ago now of a podcast I listened to where they're just doing listener feedback and all that, and one of the things the guy got really personal about was how weird and stressful it is for him to go places now because people just come up to him and start talking and throw around these inside jokes that they have and their
Oh,
group on the
wow.
podcast. But it's like, hi, I don't have any clue who you are. I don't know you.
Right.
Like, can you introduce yourself first rather than just jump
Yeah.
in, try and use these inside jokes that I have with my friends?
Oh,
Because
no.
but you think about, I mean, but it happens when you're listening to
Yeah.
someone all the time in the car, on a run, in the shower. I mean, someone is in your ears. There's that sense of, "Oh, okay, we've really gotten to know each other." Well, it's a one-way thing.
I think that that's something that happens probably more than it ever has in the past with
Yeah.
people anyone who has a platform that makes them very visible. There
Mhm.
are so few barriers now. Like if you think back 20 years, right? If you were I use Taylor Swift as
Yeah.
an example a lot because it's very timely and she's everywhere still, even though her tour is over. Um, Sorry, Mia. But apology to our poor colleague Mia, who loves Taylor Swift to the
Mhm.
ends of the earth. But I wonder what her what the fanaticism around her might look like 20 years ago versus now.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it now, you have Instagram, you have
Mhm.
all of these other channels where you can feel like you're interacting
Yeah.
with people that you're never going to meet. And I think it creates that a similar false sense of intimacy where it's like if you think about celebrities that are making the choice to put shapes and emojis over their children's faces on social
Mhm.
media photos because they're trying to maintain some of that. There is something about giving people that strangers that
Mhm.
window into your personal life beyond just seeing you in a film or on a stage or you know um listening to them on an album. It's very different now where a lot of those walls are very blurred. And
Yep.
so that's really interesting. I didn't realize there was an actual term for that,
Yeah.
but
Yep. And so it's funny you mentioned Taylor Swift because Marcus Collins worked with Beyonce on doing her
oh,
social. He was really
oh,
instrumental in building that up. And one
wow.
of the lessons he learned, that I think is key here, is that community cannot be built; it has to be facilitated. Because they
Mm,
tried creating their own Beyonce community and no one joined it, and they start looking around. It's like, oh, well, there's already this group where they call themselves the
interesting.
Beehive.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so why are we trying to create a separate thing? Let's instead support
right.
them, facilitate that, give them
Yeah,
insider things, things like that, rather than try to create our own. And you see this with institutions. Hey, use this hashtag. Well, okay, if there's already a hashtag people are organically using,
yeah,
try to
yeah.
create your own thing. Don't
That's
it?
so
Yeah,
good.
it's
That's
like 30 Rock, I think it was from with Steve Buscemi of
great.
where he's pretending to be a kid in a high school.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
No. You can't I think that's so the headline there is that you can't force community, which is
Yes.
really interesting. It's not something you can orchestrate, but it is something that you can support.
Yes.
And that just
Yeah.
speaks to the importance of one, having your ear to the ground so you know where those communities are, but also being okay with letting go of I think that's the other thing. A lot of businesses, institutions, probably individual high profile people, you want to have that control. You want to
Mhm.
manage anything that's associated with your brand. But there are some things that can happen organically independent of your team that can be very positive that you can tap into. So it's just important to keep your ears to the ground and know where those things are already happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And on one last note on parasocial relationships, I love when people come up and I get to meet people at conferences and things like that. But also I'm an anxious introvert. So don't please introduce yourself first. Please say don't
Well, I think that'll surprise people too, people who don't know you. I
Yeah.
think there's an assumption that because you're comfortable with talking to a room full of hundreds of
Mm.
people or being on a podcast and doing the work that we do, that you're an extrovert. I
Mhm.
tell people I'm an extrovert for a living,
Yeah.
because I actually am an extrovert,
Yeah.
but not everyone is. It actually is possible to have a role like this and still be
Mhm.
introverted and I
Oh,
am also
absolutely.
anxious. So, there's
Yep.
that piece that
Well,
I still need a little bit of an intro if
yeah.
I see you out in the
Yep.
wild.
Yeah, I love meeting people, I love having conversations, but boy, you put me in a packed room where I have to be social and you'll find me off on the edges having a panic attack, so
Oh no. I just will and Will and I have talked about this, but my I this has become more true than in the past, but even though I am an extrovert, I prefer having one very deep conversation with
Mhm.
someone in a large social setting than 15 surface level
Yeah,
conversations. So you'll find me in that packed room sitting at a table talking to one person for 2 hours instead of moving
yeah,
around and spending, 5 minutes
yep,
with 20 different people.
yep.
It's interesting.
It's very it's I love conferences, I love stuff like that because of the things you learn and those one-on-one conversations.
Yeah.
Oh boy, large packed rooms are a lot. Uh, okay, the second big theme from AMA,
Mhm.
talking about big packed rooms. Uh, this I think it's really related to recruitment, and that's why I wanted to touch on this here. Uh, when doing user research, user discovery, project discovery, whatever you want to call it, there was a really interesting. I wish I had jotted down the study they got this from. When you're talking to people, trying to learn what the problems are, what the pain points are, what works, what doesn't, you only need 5 to 10 people, and that was really interesting. They said after that, it sort of the new issues discovered just plateaus. Um, so
Hmm.
whereas if you're trying to do a parent survey, a student survey, and get a critical mass that you can look at and have meaningful data, you need a large data set there. But
Mhm.
if you're saying what doesn't work about this web page, what doesn't work about this marketing piece, about this process, you only need 5 to 10 people. After that, you stop getting new issues. Uh,
Wow.
and so that where when people say, it's it would take a lot to really optimize this process, to optimize this thing. It
Mhm.
really doesn't. If you can talk to 5 to 10 students, you're in great shape. Uh,
That's
that
great.
was really interesting. I think the same thing happens when you're looking at how do we improve this recruitment process? How do we,
Mhm.
you need to just focus in on a few people. I mean, make sure that they're a diverse group of people. Like if you want to
Right.
know about a single process, don't talk to all students of the same major who came from the same area.
Right. Right.
But so the other piece there, and this was from that same session on user discovery, asking open-ended questions to get that context, and then pausing to leave time for them to answer and reflect. I
Hmm.
think the same thing
Mhm.
happens when you're building relationships and recruiting. When you're talking to a student, don't ask yes or no questions. Ask open-ended questions. You build the context that way. You can have jumping off points, and then pausing to let them answer. I
Yeah.
know, and that's where it's interesting when we talk about extroverts and introverts. A lot of people in recruitment are extroverts. They
Yeah.
want to talk to this person, they want to jump in, they want to keep talking, they want. But if you instead leave that pause, you leave space for them to answer, you're going to
Mhm.
get a deeper relationship. You're going to get deeper answers instead of just the surface level.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah. It was an
It's a good
interesting one.
takeaway.
Yeah, it's one where yes, it was about user discovery, but I keep finding little touch points to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Last one, a big theme that went across multiple sessions is this need for creating sustainable change.
Mm.
Uh, one of the sessions, I believe it was Carrie Phillips and Allison Tercio, uh, they really emphasized you need to look at the things you do in context of what is core to your identity, core to who you are, versus what's habit. And I think that crosses a lot of lines in terms of
Yeah.
what's our marketing breakdown, what's our messaging, what are our events that we run, what are our tactics, what high schools do we visit, what's
Right.
core to what we're doing versus, well, we've always done that, so we have to do it. It's tradition. Traditions aren't always great things.
That applies to so many different things.
Yep.
That's
That's why I'm going to
yeah.
toss that out and leave it there for everybody. And they really dove deep into 4 strategies to creating change. First one being building trust and credibility. You have to be
Mhm.
able to showcase yourself as, I'm an expert. I'm not just coming in to make change for the sake of change. And you have to do it in a way that builds trust among people who may have been doing these things that you're tossing out the door for the past 30 years.
Right.
Uh, really working to collaborate across the institution, across communities, um, across different across segments, essentially. So the prospective students, current students, athletes, musicians, alumni, parents, you being able to collaborate across these groups, bringing them all together and getting them all on board. Really emphasizing data and insights.
Mm.
That's a big one I liked. Uh, Not just doing something because, well, I think we should, but doing the groundwork, being able
Yep.
to back up and say, here's why we're doing this, and then doing it sustainably. Not just doing this thing and not having support in place to make sure it's not just successful this month, this year. Is this a process that's going to keep working and has the backing that's not just going to peter out in 6 months, a
Right.
year, 5 years? Uh, there were interesting in a few different sessions. I pulled some things together talking about when you meet resistance, because when you're
Mm.
changing things, it always goes smoothly. But in the off chance that you meet resistance, uh, doing it in small shifts. They talked about 2-degree shifts. Um,
Hmm.
and then from another session, pulling this in, focusing on how people are dissatisfied with how things are now. So while they may be pushing back, if you can point out, well, here's the things you identified as being pain points, here's what we're addressing. If you're not happy with it now, shouldn't we change it? We can't
Right.
just sit back and keep doing it, even though you say you don't like it or it's broken.
That's great.
Um,
Yeah.
and building these models for change, we need to ensure that they are flexible. So it's not just what is a dart in the torpedo straight ahead. We can adjust, we can slither back and forth. Uh, they have to be scalable. This isn't just working for a single project or a single aspect. Is this going to
Mhm.
work and grow, as we change? It has to be adaptive. We have to be able to have
Yeah.
these check-ins and say, well, things have changed now. Right? A lot changed in 2020, and you saw who was adaptive and who wasn't. Uh, and then they closed on a good one, so I'm going to close on the same. This 2-2-1 model. When you have a lot of ideas, a lot of things you could be doing, using a 2-2-1 model, where 2 things you can implement right now, where 2 things that you can implement in 6 months, and what's one big idea you want to invest in.
I love that.
Yeah. So that was a big one. I'm notorious for saying, there's so much I want to do. Where do I start? What do I do? Um, this it's a helpful framing, I think, of, okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
2 things right now. 2 things that'll help us 6 months. One big idea I want to invest in that's going to take a while.
That's very cool. And I
Yeah.
I you know, I love a framework
Yep.
and, so that's really neat, and I think that's a really solid takeaway for us to end on for
Yeah.
folks.
There was
221.
there was so much from AMA. I hope I've distilled it down well. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, just a great conference. Hope people consider it in the future. But yeah, and there was some great conversations. So Angie Cooksey, who is at Southern Illinois now. Um, she's on the admissions side, but she went to it. It's a marketing conference, and she and Ryan Barbold and I were all talking about how there's so much value if you are on the recruitment side, if you're on the enrollment side, going to a marketing conference, and vice versa. If you're on the marketing
Yes.
side, go to a NACAC, a ACRA, SEM, and really hear and see what's going on the other side.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, you're going to bring back new ideas. You're going to hear different perspectives, and it's not a conferences shouldn't be these siloed things.
Mhm.
You're going to learn things. Always learned a tremendous amount going to CASE, which emphasizes advancement,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of techniques, things you can learn there. It still touches on marketing communications, but there's a lot you can take back and learn for recruitment as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I always really advocated for the importance of admissions and marketing professionals to attend conferences together,
Mhm.
especially in K-12, because it's really powerful for you to one, get a little bit more of a window into what it's like to walk in the other person's shoes, but it also makes the work that you're able to do together so much more effective because
Mhm.
you're kind of working from the same playbook and hearing the same things. And so, one of the things that I loved doing in my previous life was to attend conferences with my enrollment leader, and you can meet in between sessions and talk
Yeah.
about, exchange ideas and brainstorm about what you're going to do when you get off the plane and get back to your office, and how you're going to move forward together. So there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah. Yep. Well, great closing. Great to chat and decompress. Uh,
Yes.
yeah. Hope everyone out there has a great start to the year and stays well.